Isn't it quite fitting that as we approach Halloween, we put in one of the scariest performances of the season? After the game, I was in complete shock. I had to watch the game again to try and understand how this performance became a thing to begin with, and after watching it for a second time to really understand what I'd seen, I think Graham Potter was completely right to put the blame on himself. Here's what he had to say after the game.
Like I said, I'm not going to throw the players under the bus at all because they've been brilliant for us. They've given everything for me. So I have to take responsibility and try to find a way for us to do better.
And he's right. At this level in the Premier League, you need structure to have a chance against very good clubs you're competing against in the league. Potter was right to say that he made us too open against Brighton. I'm sure he learned a lot about himself and the team, but let's keep things real. This was his first defeat in 10 games and he follows the same track record set by Frank Lampard and Thomas Tuchel, with them all sharing the fact that they conceded 4 goals in their first defeats. In today's video, I kind of want to experiment a bit. I want to analyze and understand how we lost this game and what we're learning from Potter's back 3 setup. So I hope you guys definitely enjoy, share your thoughts and opinions behind the game, and to get straight into the video. So let's start things off by discussing the tactics and the game plan. At this point in time, we have to understand that Graham Potter is trying to encourage a more fluid back 3 system at this point in time. He wants to move us away from a more conservative approach of using a back 3 system, and this is why we're seeing quite a lot of very peculiar lineups used by Graham Potter. The thing is though, when you use systems like this, you have to be very aggressive with your press in the final third, you have to be very compact, and you need your defensive line to be engaged and very aggressive to deal with danger in front of them. And these were all the things we lacked in our defeat versus Brighton. As we can see with the formation, I kind of see it as like a 3-5-2, but really, as the game evolves in phases, in defensive phases, offensive phases, and in the build-up, I'd probably say on average it's more of a 3-2-2-3 system. Essentially, you have Pulisic and Raheem Sterling. Their jobs were to keep the width, to stretch Brighton's defensive lines as well too. Of course, in the interior channels here, you have Mason Mount and Conor Gallagher, who have the license, of course, to push further forward to support the attack. And they can make those overlapping runs out wide too, whenever guys like Sterling and Pulisic drop deeper. In the pivot, you have Ruben Loftus-Cheek and Mateo Kovacic. Ruben was a lot more defensive orientated, and as we see with Graham Potter, a lot of times, if one of the wide centre backs pushes forward to engage, a lot of times Potter wants his DM to fall deeper to make part of like a makeshift back four. So that was his responsibilities, and of course Mateo Kovacic had the license, of course, to get forward and of course to engage with a high press as well too. Our game plan to beat Brighton was to create overloads versus their back line and their midfield as well, by essentially creating 5v4 opportunities. And here's how it looked on screen. Havertz stays centrally, he gets the attention of Webster and Dunk. Of course, naturally, their fullbacks have to revert a bit deeper in fields. And this is where Sterling and Pulisic hold the width, occupy the fullbacks, allowing someone like a Conor Gallagher and Mason Mount, of course, to attack in the half spaces. Basically, we wanted to box Brighton in these central areas by occupying their midfield players as well as the attention of their fullbacks. Now, there was one significant moment in game where there was a double miss from Gallagher and Pulisic, which really clearly identifies what Potter was trying to build versus Brighton. So what's went wrong versus Brighton? I think on first inspection it's quite clear to see, and it simply comes down to this: we gave away everything down the flanks. And when you have players like Raheem Sterling and Christian Pulisic who weren't able to track back, and let's be realistic, how can we expect them to bomb up 70 yards to join the attack, follow a Stupian, for example, down the flank, and then make a bursting run again to support the attack? It's demanding way too much, and it's no surprise why things ultimately failed in the end.
Yeah, the responsibility for them two wasn't to defend against their wing backs, but I understand whenever you do something and it doesn't work, you look a bit of a fool.
On top of this too, we saw some terrible combination plays in the final third, bad decision making time and time again, and we constantly had attacks breaking down in Brighton's half, literally giving them the flanks to create counter attacks against us and play through our press. Brighton were constantly able to evade our press, and it kind of worked like this, to be fair. A lot of times, for example, Trossard would drop deeper to become another option to receive balls in behind. Of course, our midfield lines over here. Brighton also did very well to occupy our wide centre backs. March was going 1v1 versus Cucurella all game, Matoba was very intelligent actually with his movement, you know, constantly drifting in and out. Of course, you know, trying to take Chalobah out of the game. And by doing this, what this meant was that Brighton were constantly able to create overload opportunities against us in the wide areas here. And we'd constantly see Estupiñán, for example, making overlapping runs into spaces where Brighton could play through balls, taking out our midfield and defence time and time again. And it's no surprise why Estupiñán played a massive part in actually getting a goal for Brighton in that first half. I guess this game plan was always going to be very ambitious against Brighton, who are a very good team that Potter himself knows down to a T, and they're coached well by De Zerbi, and he likes to get his midfield playing a lot of quick, short combination passes, of course releasing wide players with overlapping runs down the flanks. Now let's examine two key areas in which we dramatically fell versus Brighton. One was the build-up phase. Right from the opening minutes of the game, Brighton showed their intent. They pressed with 4 up front, and they looked to close down any passing options into our midfield. For me, Thiago Silva had a pretty poor game against them, and he kind of typified our struggles at playing out from the back versus Brighton. Matoma and March did a very good job in blocking the passing channels that Chalobah and Cucurella, you know, typically play into the midfields. So it was no surprise that eventually we conceded a goal very early on in that first half. Now for me, the main area in which we lost this game came to our very inconsistent aggressive press. Now when it worked, it really worked, and I want to go back to that double missed opportunity from Conor Gallagher and Christian Pulisic, because on paper, theoretically, this is what Graham Potter was trying to achieve versus Brighton. We were successfully able to box our midfield in. Mount and Gallagher pressed Caicedo and McAllister. Kai Havertz was pressing the centre backs as well too, and of course you have the wingers of course occupying the spaces out wide to just pin back those Brighton fullbacks. Now Brighton's weapon to play through our press was to have Trossard playing as a false 9, dropping deeper to receive those passes. However, he was successfully blocked off, and that was because Thiago Silva of course left his defensive line engaged with him and won that ball back. This allowed us to create those overload opportunities against them, and for me, you know, this was very poor that we weren't able to score from this opportunity, especially from Christian Pulisic, who had the rebound effort on his stronger foot, which could have changed the entire complexion of this game if it became 2-1 at that point in time. But before I end my point, I want to further examine Thiago Silva. For me, this is one of his poorest games in the Chelsea shirt, but at the same time, I kind of felt like he was left out to dry time and time again. Thiago Silva, he's old, he's experienced, world-class defender, but his defending works best when he's defending our boxes, not when he has to leave his offensive line to engage further up the field. Trossard came on top of Silva time and time again, and for this system to work with this high aggressive press, you need your defenders who are going to engage, leave their line to win those battles time and time again. So for me, you're expecting a bit too much from Silva in those regards. Maybe with more complementary players like a Fofana, maybe future signings like Gvardiol, etc, there could be more success. So the main issue this created was that we had half the team wanting to engage in the press high up the field, and we had the rest of the team sitting deeper as well too, which created big distances in midfield. This allowed Brighton to play in behind the midfield lines time and time again, and then stretch us out wide on the break, and we just weren't able to cope. And for me, this is where Potter takes full responsibility, because the players look very confused on the field and didn't look very confident. So right now, let's look at the numbers of the game. Let's look at the average positionings. Let's look at the data to further examine what went wrong versus Brighton. Now I'm going to use who scored to get the data from the game, and as you can see from the average positioning from both teams, look at the structure you're seeing from Brighton. Look at the compactness in midfield. Look how close people are to each other in those midfield areas. It's no surprise that we had so many attacks broken down time and time again. And on the other hand, look at how narrow we were in the final third. Look at all the space we're afforded to Brighton in the wide areas, and look at how stretched our back three is. I mean, it's the most disorganized back three I've seen in a very long time. The defensive line was non-existent, and Brighton were very successful in separating and isolating our back three. Now when you compare our previous game versus RB Salzburg playing the same way, look how completely different the average positioning is. It looks a lot more structured, and that was most definitely missed versus Brighton. I mentioned how compact Brighton were in those central areas. I mean, you can see from the tackles attempted in the game. Look how many tackles Brighton won in those central areas in their half. And compare that to us. We won nothing against them. They were constantly dissecting us and playing through us. And you also notice that most of Brighton's blocks also came in those central areas. And look, we won nothing in midfield. No blocks, no tackles. When your midfield gets taken out the game, essentially you've kind of lost the game to begin with. And looking at the loss of possession too, most of it was in Brighton's half. A lot of it was situated around the right-hand side as well too, so there's definitely an area of improvement that we need to see under Graham Potter. Let's now examine the pass maps too in the game versus Brighton. As we can see, we're seeing that structure from Brighton. We're looking at their passing patterns. It's displaying an understanding, you know, the players know what to do when and off the ball. And here's Solly March really occupied Cucurella. You know, he was constantly taking Cucurella out of the game, and that was kind of freeing up the left-hand side for those overlapping runs from an Estupiñán or from Mitoma, of course, to drift in and out in those channels as well. And compare that to our pass map. You know, we have Raheem Sterling and Christian Pulisic who are occupying central areas, having to drift out wide. In my opinion, you know, seeing wingers having to play as cams, I don't really like it as much. You know, if you want guys who can play in those central areas, sign cams like that. I think that makes more sense. As we can see in the right hand side there, Loftus-Cheek had to drift deeper a lot of times to try and offer some sense of defensive protection down that side. The pass maps are really showing why players get breaking down in Brighton's half and why we look so defensively frail in those wide areas. So right now, to end things, I want to give my conclusion to understand what went wrong and why we saw this approach from Graham Potter. It wasn't hard to see why we lost, especially after you watched this video as well too, but I'm trying to understand why this was the approach that Potter wanted to put out there. My first train of thought was that, okay, you know Brighton inside and out. Was this necessarily the most effective way to play versus your former team? A former team where essentially, you built the foundations for them to be the team they currently are. Potter himself alluded to knowing Brighton in his press conference review after the game, so I think he took the wrong gamble by expecting too much from the wingers to try and pin back those Brighton fullbacks. He's still trying to coach understanding in the final third. That's going to take a lot more time. It took Brighton a lot of time to build that type of connection that we're currently seeing with them at this point in time. But I guess maybe this is the main reason behind why Potter decided to go for this approach versus Brighton, because I think under previous Chelsea managers, we've always focused more on the defensive side. But I think as you saw under someone like Thomas Tuchel, we were excellent in that part of the game, but we never really built any strong attacking cohesion over the few seasons that Tuchel was in charge. So that's one of the hardest things to coach in a team, and that normally takes the longest amount of time. So I understand the logic behind this approach, even though this has not worked for us whatsoever. In that previous game versus RB Salzburg, we got some hints and indications that we could suffer against better teams. For example, RB Salzburg were a lot more defensive versus us, so that definitely helped, but at the same time they matched us for shots. They had 16 shots to our 15. They created 2 counter-attacking opportunities, and they had 8 open play chances versus our 13. So they were regularly able to create good opportunities versus us. It took spectacular goals and of course being a better team in the end, but our quality shone through. So I don't know, I guess my final thought is, why has Potter decided to go for such a very adventurous 3-2-2-3 system? And I guess maybe he's been forced to do so because we have lost Reece James, and he really is like the sole reason why we can attack down the right hand side. He's used Azpilicueta there versus Man United to middling effect. He just doesn't bring that same, attacking urgency you need in the final third. So I guess he's trying to find a workaround to still have attacking threat in the wide areas. And I think that's why he's going for using like your Sterlings and Pulisics to act there instead of using a traditional wingback. I guess this is the difficult situation Potter is currently in. He didn't have a pre-season here, so he needs to find that balance between getting results in the game whilst coaching the team to play in the way he wants. And Potter wants us to rely upon a lot of line-breaking passes, a lot of speeds, a lot of overloads in the half spaces, and he wants the players to build that combination and that cohesion with themselves as well too. So this is why this won't happen overnight. Still, if there was one positive, the goal that Havertz scored really typified what we could be with more time, because that was an excellent goal. You're seeing with this goal as well too, you've got Pulisic who's occupying outside that Brighton fullback. You've got Raheem Sterling in that situation too. You've got players that are running in between 2 Brighton defenders, and normally they're the best way to create goal scoring opportunities. However, I guess it was just way too much to ask from a team that still needs a lot more time to understand and get familiar with this new way of playing. So you guys, on that note, I hope I was able to give you guys a deep understanding behind what Potter's trying to do, why we lost that game, and why we shouldn't be maybe as nervous going on into the future. So on that note, if you liked today's video, smash the like button. I'm NiniFC, this is BlueLionsTV. Catch you guys later with some more videos. Cool.